I'm Hannah.
And I'm Celine.
And welcome back to a important topic at the We
Are
Are
podcast. So,
today,
this topic, this episode, Ahana's the specialist. I don't really know what we're talking about here. I'm just as clueless as everyone else out there. So, we're going to be talking about
the demographic transition.
Who the heck knows what that is, but you're going to explain it.
Alright, so
and if you're in AP Geography right now,
Human Geography.
listen to this.
Because this will help you, a lot.
But also, just listen because...
I also think it's, important to talk about it because it provides real-world connection.
Knowledge and connections to the...
It's actually pretty cool.
Growing and progressing.
But anyway, this will help you a lot. So the demographic transition is basically, it's like this
system?
It's this...
I want to say, but I don't know.
No.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's like a graph of stages that kind of show, the progression of, countries throughout their population growth. And a part of the demographic transition is the epidemiologic transition.
Okay, can you back up and
Epidemiologic transition. So, epidemiology is the study of diseases.
Okay. That I understand. Okay.
So, epidemiologic transition correlates to the demographic transition.
So, is it the transition of diseases over a scale or something?
Kind of. Okay. So, let me just talk about the demographic transition for a second.
Yes,
so, the demographic transition has 4 stages as of now. And it basically... It details the population of a country through the stages and the patterns it faces. And I think it's really important to note because it kind of shows which countries are in poverty, have more refugees, or less developed versus the population of countries who are very wealthy, and well developed. So the demographic transition, the first stage is nomadic. It's
so that's people who move around, right?
Yeah, people who move around after their food source. They're very early civilizations, and the population is super variable, and there's just a super weird pattern of population because it just depends. It goes up and down and up and down and up and down.
Right, because they're moving all the time, and it's not consistent at all.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's the first stage. The second stage of the demographic transition kind of starts with a little bit of a more solid population, and that is after the first agricultural revolution. So the first agricultural revolution was when food didn't need to be hunted for by nomadism. It just they were able to figure out how to make food farm, basically.
Farming.
Which stabilized the population because when you don't have famine, it's easier to keep a steady population. So this stage had a very high birth rate, a decreasing death rate because of food, and a rapidly growing population. You can see this stage in poorer countries in Africa, like sub-Saharan Africa. You can see it in countries in Asia, poorer countries in Asia. You can see it in a lot of developing countries where we typically see lots of immigrants. And that's important because it just kind of shows the population patterns for poor, poverty-filled countries. The third stage is developing countries such as India. We see Mexico in this stage. We see it several countries that are kind of solidifying their government and social and medical conditions. But they're not they're still experiencing very high population growth, and they're still kind of
they're still in the development stage a little bit, but they're more developed than other
they're
stages.
Definitely. I think this is where more industry kicks in and stuff. Whereas stage 4, which is where we see all countries in Europe almost, the US, Canada, Japan, we see all those countries in stage 4. And that is this is when the CBR, the crude birth rate, which is just the birth rate, starts to decline rapidly, meaning that people are starting to have less kids, which is also a sign of having a more developed society.
I think because it's kind of a social type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing to note is that in the stage 4, the population is at an all-time high, but the increase rate at which it's growing is low. and even negative in some cases. Like in Europe, in Italy, I think, and in Japan, there's actually people who are losing their population. Like they have zero population growth, or they're decreasing. Like
but they
Russia.
still have higher populations to begin with.
Yes, so you can see throughout the stage how it kind of like goes like steady, and then super huge spike, and then a kind of like plateau at the top with a mild decrease when you go to late stage 4. And I think it's really cool because it kind of shows like how like wealthier countries reach stage 4 fast. I don't know.
Yeah,
cool.
that's really interesting.
But along with this is the epidemiologic transition.
Okay.
And that is what we'll be talking about today. And that is kind of like how diseases are prominent in each stage of the demographic transition.
Oh, okay.
By the way, the demographic transition was created by Warren Thompson.
Okay, so there are 4 stages in the demographic one. Are there also 4 in epidemiologic?
Yes, but also no.
Okay.
So there are 4 stages, but there's also like this discussion of whether stage 5 should be a thing. Like, like whether there should be a stage 5 in the demographic or in the epidemiologic transition, and which kind of relates to COVID, which is kind of cool.
Okay, interesting.
So let's talk about diseases in stage 1. So stage 1 of the epidemiologic transition sees a lot of very infectious diseases, and the biggest example I can think of would be the Black Plague. So
Black Plague.
Go tell us something about the.
Okay, so the Black Plague was taking place. It's spread by like fleas, right?
I think yeah.
So it took place in the past, I don't know.
In Europe, medieval times.
Yeah. So symptoms were headaches, fevers, weakness, infected skin, swollen lymph nodes. And it took place during a time where with medicines and like, you know, medical personnel, we weren't super developed. So we were really struggling. So it was a huge epidemic.
Yeah.
So
it killed 1/3 of the European population about. Which is insane.
Yeah, but now we obviously have ways to treat it, like antibiotics, because we're way more developed, whereas back then it just wiped people out because it was so infectious and it spread so easily, it was so transmissible. It's, in a little bit, I kind of feel like you could compare it to COVID, but it's way different because we're way more developed when COVID
we have vaccines
hit. And we have vaccines, whereas back then they didn't have vaccines, they didn't have antibiotics, so it was really bad.
And I think a lot of people back then were religiously drove, so they thought it was because like God was punishing them, when in reality it was caused by Yersinia pestis.
What is that?
That's the bacteria.
The bacteria. The bacteria that causes it. Okay, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's spread by rats and fleas. It started in Eastern Asia and spread quickly through the rest of Asia and Africa, and it was carried to Europe and North America. There's no vaccine for it, but prevention. Number 1, stay away from infected people because it's very transmissible. Keep a distance from rats and any like spreaders. And avoid ships that have not been checked for rats. So those were like the main ways back then that they avoided that. Obviously now with like, say you could compare it to COVID, we have way different ways. Like number 1, vaccine. I think medication is more of a way to avoid it, whereas back then it was just preventative measures like staying away, you know.
Yeah, and there hasn't been many Black Plague outbreaks in the US, obviously, because we have treatments and everything. Yeah. But it was really important, and stage 1 kind of shows how like it was the stage of infectious disease, and it kind of just showed how crazy that was. And it also included famine and pestilence, which is like... Yeah. We talked about it when you're following your food source. If the food source dies out, then your population is just going to drop.
Yeah, because you don't have food. Yeah, so, exactly.
Yeah. On to stage 2. So stage 2 was the receding epidemics, and it also was just like unsanitary conditions. So these were like epidemics caused by unsanitary conditions.
Okay, that makes sense. So like
a popular example is cholera.
Cholera. Okay, so I don't know much about cholera, but I do know it's spread from like unsanitary drinking water, I want to say.
Definitely. Okay. I think a very big example of cholera that people use today is the outbreak in London that was kind of solved, I guess, by a man named Jon Snow, which coincidentally is the name of the main character in Game of Thrones.
That's so funny.
No, I literally was talking about this with my mom, and she's like, "You mean the guy from Game of Thrones?" And I'm like, "No." He kind of like solved like a big epidemic, but you know,
maybe they based him off that in the story, you know.
Yeah, I don't know. It's really funny to me.
Who knows? That's funny.
Knows? But lead us through some of the symptoms.
Okay, so symptoms include pain in the abdomen, nausea, vomiting, shock, severe diarrhea, nasty, dehydration and lethargy, which is like being tired, muscle cramps and weakness, and hypotension and hypokalemia.
So hypotension is lower blood pressure, and hypokalemia, kind of same thing.
Okay.
Hypo means low.
Low. Yeah. So, yeah.
Cholera is caused by bacteria, like in water sources typically. It's spread through contaminated water.
And I think that shows how, like, poor communities were more susceptible, because poor communities usually do have a less clean water supply, or they don't have access to cleaner water, so they have to use water that has a higher chance of having the bacteria that spreads cholera.
Yeah, and actually cholera today is actually still common in areas of Africa and India, which is shown. We have a graph here, but I can't really show it
I
to
think
you.
Those two countries are definitely they experience large amounts of poverty, which explains why they're also having large amounts of, like, cholera outbreaks and stuff.
Yeah, and so the most, like, outbreak of the 7 epidemics and pandemics was the third cholera pandemic, and it killed over 1 million people.
Whoa.
So let's talk about Jon Snow. So Jon Snow was this dude, and he was really cool. I did a lot of research on him, but he basically traced the cause of the source of cholera in London to a water pump, because
so he figured out what caused it.
Yes. He did this by making a map of, like, all the cases, and I want to show this to you, but I can't. But the map showed that the cases where there was a lot of people who had it was around the water pump.
Okay, so it was a process of, like, what's in common between everyone who...
Yeah, exactly. And so what he did was he somehow convinced people to take off the water handle to the tap so people couldn't use it, and what would you know? The cases receded, and problem solved. Essentially. Not really, but essentially.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The deeper root of it was found.
So, yeah, it was insane. So it's very common in, like, a lot of places without water filtration systems, which is something that's a big issue in our world today, and we kind of need to help with that. There's a lot of water movements to help give clean drinking water.
Yeah, and there are a lot of, like, donation centers. Like, I know UNICEF works with, like, giving poor communities access and resources, which it could be water, food, anything like that. So,
yeah. So those are the first 2 stages. The first one is famine and pestilence and infectious diseases, and the second one is unsanitary conditions. And when we get into the second half, we'll talk about the 3rd and 4th and 5th stages.
All right. So,
yeah. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back from the break.
Hi.
All right.
So, let's get into it. So, stage 3 is what we're on. So
stage 3 is the start of degenerative diseases.
So what is that?
So it's basically where in stage 3, like I talked about, of the demographic transition, it's where you see society start to become more advanced per se, and just like start like lowering their birth rate. Yeah, they're lowering their birth rate, and they're lowering their growth, but it's still like an increase, but it's a lower increase.
Okay.
So like the increase is like less steep than stage 2, but it's still increasing, but they're starting to like get a lot of medical help. And so what you see in stage 3 and 4 of the demographic transition is the populations start shifting to be like even amongst younger and older people, meaning that the population of older people is growing.
Okay.
And what that means in terms of like the epidemiologic transition is that there will be a lot more diseases that affect older people. And that includes heart disease, diabetes, cancer, like so many cardiovascular issues, just so much stuff like that. That's kind of like the defining factor of diseases in that stage. And I think one of like the biggest ones I would say is cancer. I feel like that's something that's
cancer's a huge one. Yeah,
definitely it's scary.
I mean, there are a ton of types of cancer. For example, like there's brain cancer for one. If you want to tell us about.
Yes, so the example I'm going to use today is glioblastoma.
So
it sounds really complicated, but it's just a malignant type of brain tumor that affects the brain and spinal cord, and it is very fast growing. Malignant basically means that
harmful, right?
Yes,
like,
it's cancerous.
It's the opposite of benign. So benign would be like, doesn't cause any harm, harmless.
Yeah, it's harmless, but malignant is cancerous, and they're threatening because they grow rapidly and invade tissue that helps you function. And there's also primary tumors that start in cells of the brain, and metastatic tumors that are secondary and begin in other parts of the body and then spread to the brain. So those are, like, different types. But glioblastoma is, like, it originates in the glial cells that surround and support neurons in the brain, and about 1/3 of brain tumors are gliomas, so they're pretty common among people who have brain cancer. So people normally pass from 9 months to, like, a year and a half after they're diagnosed, which is really sad. That's such a short amount of time.
That's so sad. That's just a hard situation, but I think the good thing is that, like, with cancer, we're progressing with, like, science and stuff, which is helping us come up with cures. So hopefully in the future, you know.
So most causes of this are unknown, but age is a huge one, like I was talking about, genetic mutations and radiation. So if you can, try to, like, stay away from the microwave.
Yeah, don't, like, put your head in the microwave when it's spinning. Wait, that's not even possible.
But actually just standing near it while it's working for a long time.
Wearing sunscreen to prevent skin cancer. I know that's a totally different type of cancer, but like,
it's still cancer.
It just shows that there are some preventative measures. Obviously, sometimes there's nothing you can do and there's nothing to prevent it, but in a lot of cases there is.
Yeah, and, like, the interesting thing about cancer from, like, skin cancer is, like, what happens is it basically, how skin cancer occurs is, like, the sun's radiation sort of fries your ability to replicate proteins, which is a totally another topic, but I, like, love this stuff.
Okay.
I'm, like, freaking out right now. Anyway, it, like, interrupts with your ability to make protein, and proteins code for, like, tissues and, like, so many important parts of your body.
So then if you can't make proteins,
if you can't make the right proteins, if you mess up making proteins, that could ruin your whole entire body function and cause tumors.
Wow.
I could go into hours of this, but
yeah, I bet.
Yes. So now we're moving into stage 4, where treatments for these diseases are more common. That's seeing diabetic treatments, brain treatments, cardiovascular treatments. So these treatments are prominent in stage 4 because of the medical advancements and just, like, the advancing society, which is why so many people who have cancers actually move to countries who are in stage 4 and more developed, like Europe and the US, to get medical treatment.
So that's kind of how demographic transition and epidemiologic transition kind of relate.
Yeah.
Because the different stages, like,
relate with the diseases.
Yeah.
It's really cool, actually, when you get into it. I suggest you take AP Human Geography. It's pretty cool.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I, like, love disease. No, I don't love disease. It's awful, but
like, it's interesting.
Cool. It's interesting.
It's interesting.
So, a couple of the different treatments, I won't get into them, but you could get surgery, radiation therapy, which is kind of, like, counterintuitive, but it basically...
I know, it sounds so counterintuitive, but it's kind of like, you know how when you get a vaccine and you inject some of the virus into you? That sounds counterintuitive, but it works, so it's
like... So, it's commonly used if people can't undergo surgery, and it basically, like, uses X-rays and protons to kill cancer cells instead of, like, ruining the way your DNA replicates. Chemotherapy, which is a common one, it's the use of drugs, but it has major side effects and very sad.
Yeah, like, for example, hair loss, you know.
Nausea, just awful.
Yeah.
And then TTF therapy, which is less common, but it uses, like, electrical fields to stop the cells from multiplying. So it doesn't necessarily kill them, but it slows their growth. Targeted drug therapy, like, it's kind of like chemo, but not really. It just focuses on specific parts. Clinical trials and palliative care. This is really weird, and it like, more focuses on providing pain relief than actually, like, stopping it.
Oh,
but
okay.
I guess a lot of people can use this as, like, a dual treatment with chemo, just to, like, help you deal with it, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there's a lot of risk factors for these surgeries, and they definitely don't have a guarantee at all, which is why so many people die still.
Yeah.
And it affects daily life a lot. But that's, like, stage 3 and 4. And finally, stage 5, which we both can talk about a lot.
Okay.
So stage 5, we've gone past basically everything you can talk about. We've talked about unsanitary diseases, infectious diseases, degenerative diseases, and, like, treatments in stage 4 for degenerative diseases. But there's one thing left. So
what is that?
Stage 5, this is where stage 5 comes in, and it's, like, proposed, but it's not, like, actually a part of it yet.
actual, like,
yeah, because
formal, like...
For it to be a thing, there has to be a stage 5 in the demographic transition, which a lot of geographers just don't agree with yet.
Okay.
But a lot of people are suggesting the stage 5 for the epidemiologic transition, which basically suggests the reintroduction of infectious disease, which we see through COVID.
Oh, so what do you mean by reintroduction? Like...
So basically, in stage 4 countries, because they're so densely, have such a high population of urban people, meaning that, like, places like New York City, Los Angeles, they're highly urbanized, meaning there's so many people there that once there is an accident where some disease becomes reintroduced, it spreads rapidly, causing the reintroduction of these infectious diseases. Thus, COVID.
COVID. So we all know COVID. COVID has affected all of us in different ways. So, why are they not wanting to, like, add it? Like, you know, like, what is it just because they can't add another stage to the geographic transition? Like, do they need to... Demographic, sorry. Do they need to have the same amount of stages?
I mean, the reason that the epidemiologic transition exists is because it can correlate to the demographic transition.
Oh, okay.
And so
they need to correlate. So if you add a fifth one to the epidemiologic one, that doesn't really...
But it does make sense. I mean, I kind of agree with adding a stage 5.
Yeah.
Because when you see, like, things like AIDS, malaria, and COVID-19, all those things are kind of proof that stage 5 could happen.
And they don't necessarily fit into any other of the stages necessarily. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It's hard to put the...
Because they happen in advanced societies more than even stages in stage 2 because it's so highly populated and it spreads faster.
Yeah.
So,
But it's also in, like, developed societies, too.
Yeah.
When we do have, like, treatment options, like... You know, which makes it differ from, like, the Black Plague. You know?
Exactly.
So that's why they wouldn't be put in the same category.
Yeah, and especially since, like, the where we see these, like COVID-19 was most prominent in the U.S. and, like, places like India and Europe for a long time, and those are all places in 3 and 4 of the demographic transition. So it's like this disease is affecting more urbanized locations than stage 2, stage 1.
Okay, I see.
Fun fact, no country is in stage 1 of the demographic transition anymore.
Oh, okay. That was just a past thing.
Yeah, that's a past thing. I forgot to mention that.
Okay.
Because it's, like, nomadic now. Almost every country has some source of farming. So.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, so to summarize everything that we just went over, basically, there's a demographic transition scale which splits populations into 4 different groups, basically. And then epidemiological transition, which splits diseases into 4 different groups in their
potential stage 5.
And they're basically related because certain populations will face certain diseases and treatments and stuff like that. All of those things.
Like, you'll see a country in stage 2 of the demographic transition will have diseases in stage 2 of the epidemiologic transition. So they kind of match up, you know?
They match up.
As you go along. So, and you can track a country's movement. They never move backwards to the demographic or epidemiologic transition. They're always moving forward.
Okay.
And they're... Like, a lot of countries stay in a stage longer, but they never move backwards.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that was a good lesson. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was
love that.
Like, really complicated, but, like, it makes sense.
Fun.
You know? You had fun, and I learned a lot, so, like...
Yeah, hope you guys learned a lot, too.
Yeah, so...
I will list the sources in the bio. Mostly my source is my human geography teacher. But,
yeah,
other than that...
So, you know, as you can see, it's relevant today, and it's important to know, you know... and it's interesting to learn about, too.
Yeah, to see how epidemics have evolved throughout history.
Yeah.
And diseases.
And how populations have evolved, too, and how those two things
correlate.
Yeah, exactly. So, thank you for listening.
All of our socials are linked in the bio. All of our sources are linked in the bio. Please check it out, follow us, and let us know if you want to give any recommendation.
Yeah, okay. Bye.